The Vorthak Collective was like a nightmare that came true across the galaxy. These alien creatures had turned the entire Andromeda sector into their feeding ground in just a few weeks. Commander Park Jinwoo stood on the bridge of his evacuation ship, watching helplessly as another human colony world disappeared in flames behind them. The enemy ships weren't like anything humans had ever seen before. They looked alive, with organic metal hulls that seemed to breathe and pulse with the stolen life force of 1,000 destroyed civilizations. The aliens had taken everything. They didn't just destroy planets, they consumed them completely, leaving nothing but empty space where entire worlds once existed. Their biomechanical vessels moved through space like a disease, spreading death wherever they went. Each ship was covered in what looked like living tissue, but it was actually advanced technology that could adapt and change during battle. Lieutenant Kim Mina's hands shook as she worked at her control station. "Sir, we're getting the last message from Kepler Station," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The transmission was short and terrible. First came the sounds of people screaming in terror, then complete silence. Another human outpost had been wiped out by the swarm. Jinwoo felt his heart sink as he realized that thousands of families, children and elderly people had just been lost forever. The situation was becoming hopeless. The great space fleets that had protected the galaxy for centuries were falling, one by one. The proud Altarian navy, which had never lost a major battle, was completely destroyed in just 3 days. The mysterious void dancers, whose ships could move through dimensions, had vanished without a trace. Even the ancient protector rings, massive defense stations that had guarded important worlds for over 1,000,000 years, had been torn apart like paper toys. Now the only ships left in space were refugee vessels like Jinwoo's transport. They carried the last survivors of species that had once ruled entire star systems. Families huddled together in cargo holds, carrying only what they could grab before their worlds were attacked. Children cried for parents who hadn't made it to the evacuation ships. Old beings from ancient civilizations sat quietly, knowing they might be the last of their kind. The communication channels buzzed with Admiral Lee Hyunwoo's final order to all human forces scattered across the galaxy. Retreat to the outer colonies immediately. Prepare for the worst possible outcome. His voice carried the weight of defeat, but also a stubborn determination that was purely human. Even facing complete destruction, humans refused to give up entirely. Jinwoo looked at his crew, seeing fear in their eyes, but also something else, the same determination their admiral had shown. They were scared, but they weren't broken. As their ship joined the stream of refugee vessels, heading toward the galaxy's edge, Jinwoo made a silent promise. Somehow, someway, humanity would find a way to fight back against this cosmic horror that threatened to devour everything they had ever known or loved. Admiral Choi Sungmin couldn't sleep anymore. He stood in the command center of the massive orbital platform floating high above New Seoul, staring at the holographic display that showed their galaxy's doom spreading like a deadly virus. The map was covered in red dots, each one representing a world that had been consumed by the Vorthak. 3 human colonies had already gone completely silent in the past week. No distress calls, no final messages, just empty space where millions of people used to live. The worst part was seeing Earth itself preparing for evacuation. Humanity's birth world, the cradle of their entire civilization, was getting ready to abandon everything. Massive transport ships were being loaded with priceless artifacts, genetic samples, and whatever pieces of human culture they could save before the end came. Captain Yoon Hyun looked up from her communication console, her face pale but determined. "Admiral, I've got the latest intelligence report. The Vorthak swarm will reach our sector in exactly 72 hours. Fleet Command has just given us authorization for Project Shadowfall." Her voice carried both hope and terror. Everyone knew what Project Shadowfall meant. It was their last desperate gamble. In the construction bay below them, something incredible and terrifying waited in the shadows. The prototype warship called Defiance hung motionless in its dock like a sleeping monster. This wasn't an ordinary human ship. After months of studying captured Vorthak technology, Human scientists had done something that many considered impossible, and others called insane. They had taken alien biomechanical parts and somehow fused them with human engineering. The ship looked wrong in ways that made people uncomfortable. Parts of its hull seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, while other sections were clearly human-made metal and circuits. The hybrid technology was supposed to let the ship communicate directly with enemy vessels, maybe even take control of them, but the risks were enormous. Nobody knew what prolonged exposure to alien biotechnology might do to human minds and bodies. Sungmin had read all the scientific reports and psychological evaluations. The experts warned that crew members might lose their humanity, that the alien technology could change them in ways they couldn't predict or reverse. Some scientists feared the biomechanical systems might even be alive in their own way, with their own agenda. "Start preparing a crew roster," Sungmin ordered, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. "We're taking the Defiance into combat." "Sir, you've seen the psychological profiles and risk assessments," one of his officers protested. "The scientists say exposure to the hybrid systems could fundamentally alter human brain chemistry. The crew might not come back as the same people who left." Sungmin turned away from the tactical display and looked directly at his staff. "Those risk assessments don't matter anymore. Our choice is simple. We either try this dangerous experiment, or we watch everything we've ever loved get devoured by aliens. Get me volunteers who understand they might sacrifice their humanity to save it. Find people who are willing to become something different if that's what it takes to stop the Vorthak from destroying every human world in the galaxy." Captain Oh Min-soo gripped the armrests of his command chair as the Defiance burst out of hyperspace into what looked like a nightmare. The Tau Ceti system, once home to peaceful mining colonies and trade stations, was now a battlefield. The outer defense grid that had protected these worlds for decades was crumbling under the Vorthak assault. Explosions lit up the darkness of space as the last human defense platforms were torn apart by alien weapons. Through the main view screen, Min-soo could see the enemy swarm in all its terrifying glory. Hundreds of Vorthak ships moved through space like a school of deadly fish, their organic hulls rippling and pulsing with disgusting life. These weren't machines in any sense that humans understood. They were living creatures bred for war, their surfaces covered in what looked like exposed muscle and veins. The sight made several crew members feel sick to their stomachs. What made the Vorthak truly frightening wasn't just their appearance, but how they moved together. Every ship in the swarm acted like a single finger on a giant hand, perfectly coordinated. Through their shared alien consciousness, when one ship turned left, dozens of others would mirror the movement instantly. When they attacked, it was like watching a single predator with hundreds of claws striking at once. Navigator Park Somin's hands flew over her control panel, her voice tight with concentration. "Captain, engaging shadow protocols now." The moment she spoke those words, something incredible happened aboard the Defiance. The hybrid biomechanical systems that the crew had learned to fear suddenly came alive with purpose. Strange lights began glowing beneath the ship's hull plating, and conduits that looked half machine and half alive started pulsing with energy. The effect on the enemy was immediate and shocking. The perfect Vorthak formation began to wobble and break apart like a flock of birds hit by a sudden storm. Ships that had moved in flawless harmony for months suddenly seemed lost and confused. The Defiance wasn't just blocking their sensors, it was jamming their entire hive mind network with interference patterns that their alien brains couldn't filter out. Weapons Officer Kim Tai-ho stared at his tactical display in amazement, hardly believing what he was seeing. "Captain, they're completely confused," he whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow break the spell. "Look at this. Some of their ships are actually firing on each other. They can't tell friend from enemy anymore." For the first time since the war began, Vorthak ships were acting as individuals instead of as parts of a collective mind. Some tried to continue their attack runs, but crashed into their own allies. Others spun in circles, unable to decide which direction to go without the guidance of the hive mind. A few even began retreating, their individual survival instincts overriding their programmed aggression. Min-soo didn't waste this precious opportunity. "All weapons, "Target the largest ships first," he ordered. The Defiance struck like a hunting shark, its conventional human weapons tearing through enemies that had forgotten how to defend themselves as individuals. Vorthak vessels that had seemed invincible when working together became easy targets when separated from their collective consciousness. But even as they scored victory after victory, Minsu knew this advantage wouldn't last forever. The Vorthak were terrifyingly good at adapting to new threats. Soon they would figure out how to work around the interference, and then the real battle would begin. 3 weeks of constant fighting had turned the Defiance into something that existed between legend and nightmare. The ship appeared without warning in Vorthak-controlled space, struck hard at their supply convoys, then vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Enemy commanders had started calling it the Ghost Ship because it seemed to materialize from nowhere and disappear just as quickly. Chief Engineer Han Ji-won hadn't slept properly in days. She spent every waking moment in the engineering bay, surrounded by the strange biomechanical systems that made their guerrilla campaign possible. Her hands were stained with both machine oil and something that looked disturbingly like alien blood from the organic components she constantly modified and adjusted. "Captain, they're getting smarter about blocking our interference signals," she reported to Oh Min-soo during their daily briefing. Her eyes were bloodshot from exhaustion, but her mind remained sharp as a blade. "The Vorthak are trying to filter out our shadow protocols by adjusting their hive mind frequencies. But here's the thing. Every time they make an adjustment, I change our frequency to match. It's like a deadly game of cat and mouse, except we're both the cat and the mouse." This constant battle of wits between human creativity and alien computational power was taking its toll on everyone. The crew was winning, but victory was changing them in ways that nobody had expected or prepared for. The biomechanical systems weren't just tools anymore. They were becoming part of the crew. Pilot Lee Dong-yun was the first to notice the changes in himself. His reaction times had become impossibly fast, and his spatial awareness had expanded beyond normal human limits. During battles, he could sense enemy ships moving through space even before they appeared on the sensors. "It's hard to explain," he told Communications Officer Song Yeji during one of their quiet moments between battles. "The ship isn't just carrying us anymore. It's teaching us. I can feel the patterns in how the Vorthak move and think. Sometimes I know what they're going to do before they do it themselves." Other crew members were experiencing similar changes, though not all of them were comfortable improvements. Some reported vivid dreams where they felt connected to a vast network of minds spanning the galaxy. They would wake up with knowledge they shouldn't have, understanding alien concepts that no human had ever learned. Medical Officer Ahn Seojun documented these changes with growing concern. "The biotech exposure is rewriting our neural pathways," he explained to Captain Minsu. "We're becoming something new. Not quite human anymore, but not alien either. We're evolving into something that can fight the Vorthak on their own terms." Each successful battle taught them more about their enemy's weaknesses, but it also pushed them further away from their original humanity. The crew could feel themselves changing, becoming more connected to each other and to the ship's hybrid consciousness. Some embraced these changes as necessary adaptations for survival. Others worried they were losing the very humanity they were fighting to protect. Captain Minsu watched his crew transform day by day, knowing that every victory brought them closer to becoming something unprecedented in galactic history. They were no longer just humans operating alien technology. They were becoming a bridge between two completely different forms of life, and nobody knew where that transformation would ultimately lead them. The Battle of Epsilon Fornax started, like any other fight, but it ended up changing everything the crew of the Defiance thought they knew about their enemy. They had tracked a Vorthak hunting pack to this remote star system, planning another hit-and-run attack on what they assumed were just more alien ships. But as their shadow protocols engaged and the biomechanical systems came online, something completely unexpected happened. Engineer Han Ji-won was monitoring the hybrid systems when her instruments began showing readings she had never seen before. The biotech components weren't just jamming the enemy's hive mind network, they were doing something far more profound and disturbing. Her hands shook as she studied the data flowing across her screens. "Captain, you need to see this immediately," she called out, her voice filled with amazement and horror. "The interference signals aren't just disrupting the Vorthak coordination. They're actually freeing individual ships from the collective consciousness. Look at these readings. Separate biosignatures are emerging from what we thought were single alien minds." Captain Ominsu rushed to her station and stared at the incredible data. On the tactical display, something unprecedented was happening. Several enemy ships had broken away from their formation and were now broadcasting signals that no one had ever heard before, surrender codes mixed with what sounded like cries for help. Medical Officer An Seojun's communication station suddenly exploded with activity. Strange transmissions were pouring in from the isolated Vorthak vessels, but these weren't the usual cold, mechanical messages from the hive mind. These were individual voices speaking in dozens of different alien languages, many of which sounded ancient and forgotten. "Captain, I'm receiving personal communications from those ships," Seojun reported, his face pale with shock. "These aren't Vorthak voices. They're speaking languages from species we thought were extinct. They're saying things like, 'Help us. We remember, and please don't let them take us back.'" The horrible truth began to sink in as the crew listened to these desperate pleas. The Vorthak hadn't simply destroyed the civilizations they conquered. They had done something far worse. They had absorbed entire species into their collective consciousness, erasing individual identity while keeping the victims alive and aware deep inside the hive mind. "They're remembering who they were before the assimilation," Seojun explained, his voice breaking with emotion. "The Vorthak didn't just kill these people, they turned them into prisoners inside their own minds. Our shadow protocols are breaking down the mental barriers that kept them trapped." Captain Minsu felt sick as he realized what this meant. Every Vorthak ship they had destroyed might have contained the enslaved minds of innocent beings from conquered worlds. They weren't just fighting an invasion force, they were fighting to free the trapped souls of dozens of civilizations that had been forced to participate in their own people's destruction. The freed ships began transmitting detailed information about Vorthak weaknesses, shared willingly by beings who had been forced to serve their captors for decades or even centuries. These weren't willing converts to an alien cause. They were victims who had been waiting for someone to break their chains. As more enemy vessels broke away from the collective and joined the growing group of freed ships, the crew of the Defiance understood that their mission had become something much larger than they had ever imagined. They weren't just trying to stop an invasion. They were leading a liberation movement that could free millions of enslaved minds across the galaxy. News travels fast through the galaxy, especially when it carries hope in the darkest of times. Stories about the mysterious human warship that could break Vorthak formations spread like wildfire through refugee camps and hidden colonies. At first, many dismissed these tales as desperate fantasies, wishful thinking from people who had lost everything. But as more survivors witnessed the Defiance in action, the stories became impossible to ignore. Ships began appearing at the edges of human space, requesting permission to join what was becoming more than just a resistance movement. These weren't just human vessels filled with evacuees. Some of the arrivals were species that everyone thought had been completely wiped out by the Vorthak decades ago. The crystalline resonance arrived first, their geometric ships sparkling like diamonds against the black of space. These beings had been among the first to face the Vorthak invasion, and most people assumed their entire civilization had been destroyed. But a few hundred had survived by hiding in the deep spaces between star systems, waiting for a chance to strike back. Then came the Flux Collective, beings made of pure energy who could barely exist in normal space without special containment fields. They had spent years phasing in and out of different dimensions, avoiding detection while watching their physical homeworlds burn. Their arrival was announced only by the strange aurora-like lights that danced around their energy-based ships. Most surprising of all were the three massive Altarian dreadnoughts that emerged from hyperspace with battle damage covering their hulls. These proud warrior ships had been presumed lost with the rest of their navy, but they had somehow fought their way out of impossible battles and spent months searching for allies. Admiral Choi Sungmin found herself commanding something that had never existed before in galactic history. A fleet made up of species that had been mortal enemies for thousands of years, now united by their shared suffering and common purpose. The command deck of the Defiance became a meeting place for beings who spoke different languages, breathed different atmospheres, and thought in completely different ways. Science Officer Yang Minjae worked day and night to coordinate the various technologies being offered by their new allies. "Admiral, the possibilities are incredible," he reported during one of their planning sessions. "The resonance can amplify our shadow effect by channeling it through their crystal matrices. The flux beings can phase through Vorthak bioarmor like it doesn't exist. We're creating something completely new." The Defiance itself was changing to accommodate these new partnerships. Its hybrid systems began incorporating technology from every species in the growing fleet. Crystalline resonance chambers were installed alongside energy phase conduits and Altarian weapon systems. Human engineers worked side by side with alien technicians, sharing knowledge that had been kept secret for millennia. Pilot Lee Dongyun spent his shifts feeling the ship transform around him. The biomechanical systems that had once felt alien and disturbing now pulsed with a warm, familiar presence that seemed to know him personally. "The ship is becoming something we've never seen before," he confided to Navigator Park Somin during a quiet moment. "It's not just carrying us anymore. It's becoming alive, becoming part of all of us." The consciousness that inhabited the hybrid conduits was no longer purely human or alien. It had become something entirely new, a fusion of dozens of different forms of awareness, all held together by humanity's unique gift for bringing different peoples together and finding common ground, even in the darkest circumstances. The truth about the Vorthak came from the most unlikely source, the freed alien minds that had been trapped inside enemy ships for decades. As more vessels broke away from the collective consciousness, their liberated crews shared horrifying secrets that had been hidden in the deepest parts of the galaxy for millions of years. Medical Officer An Seojun spent weeks interviewing the rescued beings, piecing together fragments of memories that painted a picture more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The primary nexus wasn't just some military command center built by the Vorthak. It was something far older and more disturbing. "Admiral, you need to understand what we're really dealing with," Seojun reported to the command staff, his face pale from the revelations he had uncovered. "The Nexus isn't their command ship. It's their origin point, their first victim. Millions of years ago, the Vorthak found a peaceful world at the center of our galaxy and consumed it completely. But instead of destroying it, they transformed the entire planet into a living computer that could coordinate their expansion across space." The freed aliens described the Nexus as a writhing mass of biomechanical tissue the size of a small moon, covered in organic processes that contained the enslaved minds of the very first species the Vorthak had ever conquered. This ancient civilization had become the brain of the collective, forced to plan and coordinate the destruction of countless other worlds. Any conventional attack on the Nexus would be hopeless. The structure was protected by thousands of bioships arranged in defensive formations that had been perfected over millions of years. Worse, the entire galactic core was filled with gravitational anomalies and space-time distortions that made normal travel impossible. Ships that tried to approach through hyperspace would be torn apart by the warped physics around the Nexus, but the Defiance and its growing fleet weren't conventional forces anymore. Admiral Choi Sungmin studied the tactical data with her mixed crew of humans and aliens, knowing they had advantages that no traditional military force could match. "We don't attack the Nexus," she announced during their final planning session. "We become the attack ourselves. Every freed Vorthak ship, every hybrid system we've created, every consciousness we've liberated, they're all connected through our shadow network now. We turn our entire fleet into one massive interference pattern. The plan was audacious, beyond anything attempted in galactic history. Instead of fighting their way to the target, they would coordinate hundreds of ships and thousands of minds into a single purpose. The Defiance would serve as the central node, connecting human determination, alien wisdom, and hybrid technology into one unified force." As the diverse fleet began moving toward the galactic core, something incredible happened. The consciousness that had been growing within the Defiance's biomechanical systems expanded to encompass every ship in their armada. Human pilots found themselves sharing thoughts with crystalline resonance. Energy beings merged temporarily with organic minds. Former Vorthak victims contributed their knowledge of the collective's weaknesses. Pilot Lee Dong-hyun felt the network growing stronger as they approached their destination. "It's like we're becoming one giant mind," he reported to Admiral Sung-min. "But we're not losing ourselves like the Vorthak do. We're staying individual while choosing to work together." The final battle wouldn't be fought with weapons alone. It would be a clash between two completely different philosophies of existence, with the fate of every free mind in the galaxy hanging in the balance. The primary nexus filled their view screen, like a nightmare made real. What had once been a living world millions of years ago was now a grotesque fusion of organic tissue and mechanical components the size of a small planet. Its surface pulsed with a sickening rhythm, like a massive heart beating with the combined thoughts of billions of enslaved minds. Veins of bioluminescent fluid ran across its surface, carrying information and commands to Vorthak forces scattered across the entire galaxy. The Defiance led the charge toward this abomination, but they weren't alone. Behind them flew the most diverse fleet in galactic history. Humans, crystalline beings, energy creatures, and freed Vorthak ships all working together. Their combined shadow effect created something unprecedented, a wave of interference so powerful it began disrupting the nexus from thousands of miles away. Chief Engineer Han Ji-won worked frantically at her station, making the final adjustments to their hybrid systems. Sweat poured down her face as she prepared what might be humanity's last gamble. "The virus program is ready, Captain," she announced, her voice steady despite the terror they all felt. "But there's a problem. Someone needs to connect directly with the Nexus to upload it into their central network. The psychic feedback from interfacing with billions of enslaved minds could destroy whoever attempts it." The command deck fell silent. Has everyone realized what this meant? Someone would have to sacrifice themselves, possibly losing their sanity or their life, to give the rest of the galaxy a chance at freedom. Captain Oh-min-soo didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his face calm with the acceptance of someone who had always known this moment would come. "I'll do it," he said simply. "The ship has been preparing me for this ever since we first activated. The biomechanical systems. I can feel it. This is why everything had to happen the way it did." The biomechanical interface looked like something from a fever dream. Organic cables that seemed to breathe, connecting to a chair that appeared to be grown rather than built. As Min-soo sat down and allowed the alien tendrils to connect with his nervous system, he felt his consciousness expand beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. Suddenly, he wasn't just Captain Oh-min-soo anymore. He became a bridge connecting two completely different forms of existence. Through him flowed the hopes and dreams of every free being in their fleet, while at the same time he touched the vast cold intelligence of the Nexus. The virus he carried wasn't just computer code. It was something far more powerful and dangerous to the collective mind. It was the pure concept of individual choice, the idea that every thinking being had the right to determine their own destiny. The moment the virus made contact with the Nexus, everything changed. The massive bioconstruct began to convulse and shudder as the infection spread through its network like wildfire. Across the galaxy, Vorthak ships suddenly stopped in the middle of their missions as their crews began to remember who they had been before assimilation. On distant worlds, beings who had been forced to serve the collective for centuries suddenly looked around with their own eyes, spoke with their own voices, and made their own choices for the first time in living memory. The rigid hierarchy that had controlled trillions of minds began to crumble as individual consciousness reasserted itself throughout the vast network. The age of the collective was ending, and the age of freedom was about to begin. 6 months had passed since the moment that changed everything, and the galaxy was still trying to understand what had happened. The battle of the primary nexus had ended in a way that nobody could have predicted. Instead of destroying their enemies, humanity had freed them. The massive Vorthak collective that had terrorized civilizations for millions of years had broken apart into hundreds of independent species, each one struggling to remember who they had been before they were forced into the hive mind. The transformation was happening everywhere. On worlds that had been stripped bare by the collective, new cities were being built by beings who were experiencing individual thought for the first time in centuries. Former Vorthak soldiers were learning to make personal choices, to have private thoughts, and to form relationships based on friendship rather than shared programming. The Defiance had become something completely unique in galactic history. Admiral Choi Sung-min now commanded not just a warship, but the flagship of the Galactic Liberation Alliance, an organization dedicated to helping freed worlds rebuild and heal from their trauma. The ship itself had evolved into a living symbol of cooperation, its biomechanical systems now incorporating technologies and consciousness from dozens of different species. Walking through the corridors of the Defiance was like visiting a living museum of galactic diversity. Human engineers worked alongside crystalline technicians who communicated through harmonic frequencies. Former Vorthak scientists shared their knowledge with energy beings who existed in dimensions humans could barely comprehend. The ship had become a place where the impossible was happening every day. Former enemies were becoming friends. Captain Oh Min-soo had survived his connection to the Nexus, but the experience had changed him forever. His mind now carried traces of the vast collective consciousness he had infected with the virus of freedom. Instead of being traumatized by this merger, he had found a new purpose. Working with former Vorthak scientists, he was developing revolutionary, new forms of communication, networks that could connect minds without erasing individual identity. The old collective was based on domination, he explained to his research team. We're creating something based on choice. People can share thoughts and experiences when they want to, but they always remain themselves. Connection without conquest. Communications. Officer Song Yeji often stood on the bridge watching the mixed crews work together, still amazed by what they had accomplished. "You know what's incredible?" she said to her human colleagues. "We didn't just defeat the Vorthak. We showed them there was another way to be connected. They thought unity meant everyone thinking the same thoughts. We proved that real unity comes from different minds choosing to work together." The changes went far beyond technology and politics. Across the galaxy, former enemies were discovering they had more in common than they had ever imagined. Species that had fought for thousands of years were finding ways to cooperate. Children who had been born into the collective were learning to play games, make art, and dream their own dreams. What made humans special wasn't that they were stronger or smarter than other species. Their gift was something much more valuable. The ability to bring different people together and help them see past their differences. While other civilizations had tried to solve problems through conquest or isolation, humans had instinctively understood that diversity made everyone stronger. The galaxy would never return to what it had been before the Vorthak invasion. Instead, it was becoming something better, a place where every voice mattered, where cooperation was valued over domination, and where the greatest strength came from unity freely chosen rather than unity forcibly imposed.